Some moments change everything in less than a heartbeat, and this was one of them. The street outside downtown Denver was quiet except for the steady rhythm of passing cars and the distant hum of afternoon traffic when Officer Daniel Brooks stepped out of his patrol vehicle and locked his attention on a woman standing near the curb. Her name was Ava Johnson, though he did not know it yet. To him, she was simply another civilian in the wrong place at the wrong time, dressed in a dark jacket, holding a small leather bag, her posture calm in a way that did not match the tension in the air. Daniel's hand hovered near his holster as he called out firmly for her to stop moving, his voice sharp with authority shaped by years of routine stops and quick judgments. Ava complied instantly, raising her hands in a slow, controlled motion that carried no panic, only steady awareness, as if she had been in situations like this before and understood exactly how fragile assumptions could be. The city seemed to quiet around them, as though even the wind had decided to slow down and watch. Daniel narrowed his eyes, studying her face, her stance, the way she did not plead or argue, and in his mind he began building a story that required no evidence, only instinct. She looked composed, too composed, and that alone made him more certain than he should have been. He stepped closer, boots pressing against the pavement, and asked her identity with the tone of someone used to receiving answers without resistance. Ava did not rush. She reached slowly into her inner jacket pocket, not breaking eye contact, and withdrew a small credential holder. The movement was deliberate, almost calm enough to feel out of place in the rising tension. Daniel let out a short, dismissive laugh as he took it, flipping it open without urgency, expecting something standard, something ordinary, something that would confirm what he already believed. Around them, a few distant pedestrians slowed their pace, sensing something unusual in the air but not yet understanding what it was. Ava remained still, her expression unchanged, her breathing steady, as if the outcome of this moment did not depend on fear but on truth being recognized at the right time. Daniel glanced down at the badge and paused for only a fraction of a second longer than comfort allowed, his expression tightening as the confidence he carried began to shift into uncertainty he could not immediately name. The street noise seemed to blur, the edges of the world narrowing to that single object in his hand. Ava's voice broke the silence, calm and precise, telling him to verify it with dispatch if he needed confirmation. The words were not loud, but they carried weight, the kind that does not demand attention but inevitably receives it. Daniel's posture changed slightly, though he tried to hold on to control, and for the first time, he looked less certain of the situation in front of him than of the assumptions he had brought into it. A distant radio crackled faintly, and somewhere behind him, the routine of the city continued, unaware that a shift had already begun in the space between judgment and truth. The radio on Daniel Brooks' shoulder came alive again with a sharper transmission, this time more deliberate, as if someone on the other end had taken a closer look at what was unfolding on the street. The voice was calm but precise, instructing him to verify the credentials immediately through official dispatch channels. Daniel shifted his weight slightly, adjusting his stance as the initial confidence he carried began to feel less stable, though he tried to mask it behind routine professionalism. Around them, the street remained active in the distant background, but the space between the two of them felt increasingly isolated, as if the world had narrowed to a conversation neither of them could avoid. Ava Johnson remained exactly where she was, hands lowered now in a neutral position, her posture unchanged, her attention steady on Daniel without pressure or agitation, only patience. He glanced down at the badge again, then back at her face, as if trying to reconcile what he believed with what was now being presented to him. The silence stretched long enough for a few passing pedestrians to notice the tension and slow their pace, though none of them fully understood what they were witnessing. Daniel finally spoke again, his tone less sharp than before, asking for confirmation details as if attempting to rebuild control over a situation that was no longer responding to instinct alone. Ava responded without hesitation, providing the requested identification details in a calm, structured manner that matched official protocol rather than emotional defense. Her voice carried no frustration, only precision, and that precision made the moment feel even heavier. A second patrol vehicle began to slow at the edge of the block, its presence subtle at first, then more noticeable as it angled toward the curb. Daniel noticed it and straightened slightly, using the arrival as an anchor to reassert his position, though something in his expression had already begun to shift. The second officer stepped out and approached with measured pace, observing both of them, then asking for a quick summary of the situation. Daniel explained briefly, still trying to frame the encounter as a standard field stop that had simply taken an unexpected turn. Ava did not interrupt him. She waited until he finished, then calmly stated that her credentials were available for immediate verification and that dispatch had already been contacted. The second officer nodded slowly, taking the information in without reaction, then spoke quietly into his radio. The atmosphere on the street subtly changed as awareness spread among those nearby that this was no longer a routine interaction. Daniel felt a tightening in his jaw as he realized the narrative he had assumed was no longer the dominant one in the space. Ava's calm presence did not shift, but it now carried a different weight, one that made it harder to dismiss or reduce to assumption. The second officer looked at Daniel for a brief moment, not accusatory, but observant, as if recalibrating the situation in real time. Daniel's earlier certainty had not vanished completely, but it was no longer guiding the moment. Instead, it hovered in the background, replaced by a growing awareness that something larger was being confirmed step by step through channels he no longer controlled. Ava finally spoke again, reminding them both that verification would resolve everything and that cooperation would ensure clarity for all parties involved. Her tone remained steady, but it now carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being validated by process rather than opinion. The street noise continued around them, unchanged, but within the circle of their focus, everything had become measured, deliberate, and carefully watched. The confirmation process continued in a controlled rhythm as Daniel Brooks stood slightly back from Ava Johnson, watching the second officer communicate through the radio with increasing seriousness. The earlier tension in Daniel's posture had shifted into something quieter, less confident, as the structure of authority around him began to reorganize itself through external validation rather than personal judgment. Ava remained composed, her attention steady and unchanged, as if the unfolding verification process was not an interruption to her day but simply a necessary formality she had experienced many times before. The second officer nodded once as he received a response from dispatch, then repeated key identifiers aloud to ensure accuracy, his tone now more formal than cautious. A brief pause followed as the radio line crackled again, and in that pause the entire atmosphere seemed to tighten, not through action, but through expectation. Daniel adjusted his stance again, glancing briefly at Ava, then at the second officer, as the realization began to settle that this was no longer a matter of interpretation. The second officer confirmed the match, his expression changing subtly as he acknowledged the validity of the credentials. The words were simple, but their impact shifted the balance of the moment in a way that required no further explanation. Daniel exhaled slowly, not in relief, but in recalibration, as if reprocessing everything he had assumed in the minutes leading up to this point. Ava did not react outwardly. She simply observed the shift in behavior around her, her presence steady, her expression neutral, as though the confirmation only aligned the situation with what she had already known. The second officer stepped slightly aside and spoke quietly to Daniel, not with reprimand, but with a tone that suggested awareness of a larger procedural context now taking precedence. Daniel listened without interruption, his eyes briefly lowering before returning to Ava, where his earlier certainty had now been replaced by a restrained uncertainty he could no longer fully conceal. The street, still active with passing vehicles and distant conversations, felt visually unchanged, but the center of focus had narrowed entirely to the three figures standing near the curb. Ava finally spoke again, her voice calm and direct, stating that she was conducting an ongoing federal-level investigation in coordination with multiple agencies and that her presence in the area had been pre-approved through formal channels. The second officer acknowledged the statement with a slight nod, stepping back further to allow space for proper procedure to continue. Daniel remained still, absorbing the information in silence, his hand no longer near his holster, his posture now fully neutral as the framework he had relied upon earlier was no longer applicable. Ava's gaze moved briefly across the scene, assessing not with emotion but with professional focus, then returned forward as she confirmed that no further escalation was necessary and that cooperation would be sufficient moving forward. The moment held a quiet weight, not from confrontation, but from the clear restructuring of authority through verified identity and institutional recognition. Daniel looked down briefly, then back up, now fully aware that the situation he had entered with assumption had resolved into something far more official than he had initially recognized. The second officer prepared to document the encounter, while Ava remained centered in the space, unchanged by the shift around her, as the street returned slowly to its ordinary rhythm while the understanding between them settled into place. The quiet recalibration on the street began to settle into a more structured flow as Daniel Brooks stood near the curb, no longer at the center of interpretation but now repositioned as part of a procedural review that was unfolding beyond his individual control. The second officer had shifted into a documentation stance, speaking into his radio with measured clarity as he recorded details that confirmed Ava Johnson's identity and operational status. Ava herself remained composed, her attention forward, her posture unchanged, as though the confirmation process had simply aligned the environment with expectations she had already accounted for long before stepping onto this street. Daniel's gaze drifted briefly toward the patrol vehicle, then back to Ava, as he processed the reality that the assumptions guiding his initial response no longer held authority over the situation. The second officer closed his radio transmission and stepped slightly to the side, allowing a brief pause in communication as official procedures transitioned from verification to acknowledgement. Daniel exhaled slowly, adjusting his stance in a subtle attempt to regain composure, though the earlier certainty he had carried now felt distant and fragmented. Ava finally moved, not toward escalation or confrontation, but toward clarification, stating in a calm and steady tone that her presence in the area was part of a coordinated federal operation involving multiple jurisdictions and that her movements had been logged and approved through formal channels. Her words were not delivered with emphasis or force, but with the kind of precision that left little room for reinterpretation. The second officer acknowledged the statement with a short nod, his attention shifting fully into procedural awareness as he prepared to finalize the report. Daniel remained silent, absorbing the shift in context as the meaning of the encounter expanded beyond the immediate interaction he had initiated. The street around them continued its normal rhythm, with vehicles passing and distant conversations blending into the background, yet the focal space between the three figures felt isolated from that ordinary flow. Ava's presence remained steady and unaffected by the procedural transition, her focus moving briefly across the environment as if confirming that all elements of the situation were now aligned with operational expectations. The second officer confirmed aloud that no further action would be required from patrol units and that the matter would be escalated only through internal channels if necessary. Daniel gave a slight nod in acknowledgement, his earlier assertiveness now replaced by a measured restraint that reflected the shift in authority dynamics around him. Ava's expression remained neutral, her attention briefly meeting Daniel's before returning forward, signaling neither confrontation nor dismissal, only completion of a necessary correction in understanding. The moment held a quiet structural finality, not marked by tension or conflict, but by the clear re-establishment of fact over assumption, identity over perception, and procedure over instinct. As the interaction moved toward closure, the second officer stepped back toward his vehicle to finalize written documentation, while Daniel remained momentarily still, watching Ava as she stood unaffected by the change in tone around her. The environment gradually resumed its normal cadence, yet within that return to routine, the weight of what had just been clarified lingered in the space between them, unspoken but fully understood. The final procedural confirmation on the street had settled into a quieter rhythm, yet the atmosphere between Daniel Brooks, the second officer, and Ava Johnson remained subtly charged with the weight of reassessed judgment. Daniel stood slightly apart now, no longer directing the interaction, but observing as the second officer completed the last steps of verification through his radio and handheld device. Ava remained steady in her position near the curb, her attention forward, her posture unchanged, as if the shift in authority dynamics around her had already been accounted for long before it unfolded. The second officer spoke in a lower, more routine tone as he finalized the report details, confirming that no further enforcement action was required and that the subject was cleared through federal authentication channels. Daniel nodded once, slowly, acknowledging the procedural closure while processing the distance between his initial assumption and the confirmed reality. The street continued its ordinary motion, cars passing at intervals, pedestrians moving without pause, yet within this small pocket of space, the atmosphere felt distinctly reset. Ava finally shifted her weight slightly, not in relief, but in readiness to continue forward as if the encounter had been a brief interruption rather than a defining moment. The second officer stepped back toward his patrol vehicle, his attention returning to standard duties, leaving Daniel and Ava in a moment of quiet proximity that no longer carried tension, but reflection. Daniel glanced toward her again, this time without the urgency or suspicion that had defined his earlier posture, and instead with a restrained awareness that the situation had revealed more about perception than presence. Ava's expression remained composed, her focus directed toward the street ahead, as if already transitioning mentally back to her operational responsibilities. The environment around them had normalized, yet the residual awareness of what had just occurred lingered in subtle ways, in pauses of movement, in the spacing between decisions, in the quiet recalibration of roles. Daniel adjusted the strap of his radio slightly, an unconscious gesture that signaled closure rather than command, while Ava took a slow step forward, indicating her intent to move on without further delay. The second officer entered his vehicle and began preparing to depart, the routine sounds of a completed call returning to the street. Daniel remained for a brief moment longer, watching as Ava walked forward with steady pace, her presence no longer defined by the misunderstanding that had initiated the encounter. There was no exchange of words between them now, only a final shared acknowledgement through absence of conflict, as the situation resolved itself into procedural memory rather than active tension. The street resumed its normal cadence fully, yet the shift that had occurred remained embedded in the awareness of those who had been present, a silent recalibration of judgment, identity, and authority that required no further confirmation. The afternoon light had shifted slightly over the street, casting longer shadows across the pavement as the interaction formally concluded and the last procedural steps were signed off in. Quiet routine. Daniel Brooks remained near the edge of the sidewalk for a moment longer, his posture now fully relaxed in appearance but still carrying the faint residue of recalibration that followed the earlier misunderstanding. Ava Johnson had already begun to move forward at a steady pace, her direction aligned with the continuation of her federal responsibilities, her presence no longer defined by interruption but by forward motion. The second officer had fully returned to his vehicle, closing out the report with standard dispatch confirmations as the communication channels returned to normal operational flow. The street itself resumed its natural rhythm, with passing vehicles, distant pedestrian movement, and the ambient sound of an urban afternoon settling back into place. Daniel adjusted the position of his radio once more, not out of urgency but habit, as he watched Ava increase the distance between herself and the location where the encounter had unfolded. There was no tension remaining in his stance, only a quiet awareness that the moment had required a reassessment of judgment that could not be undone but only acknowledged internally. Ava continued walking without hesitation, her stride consistent, her focus directed ahead, as if the encounter had been a brief procedural interruption within a much larger operational timeline. The environment around her no longer reacted to her presence in any unusual way, blending her movement back into the natural flow of the city. Daniel finally turned slightly, preparing to return to his vehicle as well, but paused for a brief second as something in the silence registered more deeply than before. It was not regret in a visible sense, nor was it conflict, but rather a quiet recognition of how quickly perception could form and how firmly it could be held before being corrected by fact. Ava did not look back, yet her composure carried the same steady certainty it had held from the beginning, unchanged by the shift in how she had been received. The second officer closed his door and started the engine, signaling the full procedural end of the stop, while Daniel finally began to move away from the curb. The street. Noise filled the space again, cars passing within a few feet, a cyclist moving along the far lane, the distant sound of a pedestrian crossing signal activating at the intersection. Everything returned to its expected rhythm, yet within Daniel's internal reflection there remained a subtle awareness that the encounter had altered his understanding of presence versus assumption. Ava's figure grew smaller in the distance, blending into the flow of the sidewalk, her role in the moment no longer active but completed. The finality of the interaction was not marked by celebration or conflict, but by quiet resolution, as each participant returned to their respective paths, carrying forward the unspoken recognition of what had been clarified without escalation or disruption. As the evening light began to settle over the city, the street where the earlier encounter had taken place returned fully to its normal rhythm, as if nothing unusual had ever disrupted its flow. Daniel Brooks stood near his patrol vehicle for a final moment, looking down the road where Ava Johnson had already disappeared into the distance. The memory of the interaction remained present in his mind, not as an event of conflict, but as a sequence of assumptions that had been corrected through verified truth rather than confrontation. His posture was calm now, his movement slower, as if the pace of the day itself had shifted after the realization that authority was not defined by appearance but by confirmed identity and procedure. The second officer's vehicle pulled away first, signaling full closure of the call, leaving Daniel alone with the ambient sounds of traffic and distant footsteps echoing along the sidewalk. He exhaled once, steady and measured, then finally turned toward his own vehicle, the earlier tension completely replaced by quiet reflection. Across the city block, Ava continued forward through the sidewalk crowd, her pace consistent, her attention already redirected toward her operational objectives, no longer connected to the brief interruption that had occurred behind her. To those passing by, she appeared as any other individual moving through the city, yet the weight of what had just transpired remained anchored in the awareness of those who had been directly involved. Daniel opened his car door and paused for a fraction of a second before entering, glancing once more at the direction she had gone, now nearly indistinguishable from the movement of the city itself. Inside the vehicle, the radio returned to routine static and standard dispatch updates, reinforcing the sense that the incident had been fully resolved within official channels. He sat down slowly, adjusting his seatbelt, then placed his hand briefly on the steering wheel without starting the engine immediately, as if allowing a final moment of processing before returning to duty. The streetlights began to activate one by one along the block, casting a softer tone across the pavement, signaling the gradual transition into evening operations. Ava's figure had now fully blended into the distance, her presence no longer visually distinct, but the effect of her verified identity continued to linger in the structure of Daniel's thought. He finally started the vehicle, the engine sound breaking the quiet reflection, and as he pulled away from the curb, the intersection ahead opened into the broader city grid. The encounter, now fully concluded, remained only in memory and documentation, yet within Daniel's internal awareness it carried a subtle but lasting imprint, a reminder that perception could shift in an instant when confronted with confirmed reality, and that authority, once verified, required no further explanation. The city had fully transitioned into the quiet rhythm of evening, with headlights stretching across intersections and the steady flow of traffic returning to its familiar pattern, while Daniel Brooks drove through the streets with a calm that had replaced the earlier tension of the day. His hands rested firmly on the steering wheel, his attention on the road ahead, yet his thoughts remained partially anchored to the sequence of events that had unfolded earlier, not as conflict, but as correction. The encounter had ended within procedural clarity, but its internal imprint continued to settle in a more reflective layer of understanding. He slowed slightly at a traffic light, glancing at the crosswalk where pedestrians moved in steady lines, each person absorbed in their own direction, none aware of the brief shift in perception that had occurred just hours earlier on another block of the city. The memory of Ava Johnson remained precise in his mind, not as an image of confrontation, but as a presence defined by composure, verification, and institutional confirmation that had overridden assumption. Daniel exhaled slowly, maintaining focus on the road as the light changed and his vehicle continued forward, merging into the broader flow of evening traffic. Across the city, Ava was already several blocks away, moving through a different section of downtown where streetlights reflected against glass buildings and the sound of footsteps blended with distant conversations. Her pace remained steady, her attention forward, as if the earlier encounter had been absorbed entirely into the larger continuity of her work without interruption. There was no visible trace of the misunderstanding that had occurred, only the continuity of purpose that guided her movement through the city. Daniel adjusted his grip slightly on the steering wheel as he approached another intersection, the city lights reflecting across the windshield in soft motion. The radio remained quiet, offering only routine updates that no longer connected to the earlier situation, reinforcing the sense that everything had been formally resolved. Yet within his internal awareness, the sequence of events continued to organize itself into a clearer structure, not of conflict, but of recognition. He recalled the moment the verification had been confirmed, the shift in tone that followed, and the way authority had redefined itself through documentation rather than perception. The realization did not carry emotional weight, but it left a precise impression, like a recorded adjustment in judgment that would remain accessible in memory. Ava, now distant and indistinguishable from the flow of pedestrians in another part of the city, continued forward without pause, her presence no longer marked by disruption but by completion of a procedural cycle that had required no escalation. Daniel turned onto a wider avenue, the city opening around him in layers of light and movement, and as he drove deeper into the evening grid, the encounter settled fully into closure. The finality of the moment was not defined by reaction or consequence, but by the quiet restoration of order once verification had been achieved, leaving behind only the steady continuation of two separate paths moving forward through the same city under the same fading light. The city had fully transitioned into night, with the steady glow of streetlights stretching across intersections and the soft rhythm of traffic creating a calm and continuous backdrop as Daniel Brooks drove deeper into the urban grid. His posture remained steady, his focus forward, while the earlier events of the day settled into a quieter mental space that no longer carried urgency, only structured reflection. The verification, the procedural confirmation, and the shift in authority had all concluded within official channels, leaving behind a clean closure that required no further action. Ava Johnson, now far across the city, continued her movement through a different district, her presence blending seamlessly into the flow of pedestrians and evening activity, no longer marked by interruption or misunderstanding. She moved with consistent pace, her attention directed toward her operational responsibilities, unaffected by the encounter that had briefly intersected her path earlier. Daniel approached another intersection, slowing as the light turned red, and for a moment he observed the reflections of passing vehicles across the glass of nearby buildings, each movement blending into the larger structure of the city at night. Inside his vehicle, the radio remained quiet except for routine dispatch updates, reinforcing the sense that the earlier situation had been fully resolved through proper verification and documentation. As he waited at the light, his thoughts briefly returned to the sequence of events, not with tension, but with clarity, recognizing how quickly perception had formed and how completely it had been replaced once confirmed information had been introduced. He noticed how the memory of Ava's presence no longer carried uncertainty, but instead carried a precise understanding of authority defined through validation rather than assumption. The light turned green and he continued forward, merging into the steady flow of traffic that stretched toward the horizon of illuminated streets. Across the city, Ava passed through a quieter avenue lined with office buildings that reflected the last traces of evening light, her movement uninterrupted and deliberate, aligned with the continuity of her federal responsibilities. There was no residual tension in her expression, no sign that the earlier interaction had disrupted her operational rhythm, only the steady focus of someone accustomed to navigating environments where verification preceded recognition. Daniel drove beneath an overpass where the city lights briefly dimmed, then re-emerged as he exited into a broader roadway, the skyline opening ahead in layers of illuminated structure. The encounter from earlier in the day remained present in his awareness, not as conflict, but as a completed correction in understanding that would remain part of his professional memory. Ava continued forward through the city until she reached a more open stretch of sidewalk, where the sound of traffic softened slightly and the night air carried a cooler stillness. She paused briefly at a crossing signal, then proceeded forward as the light changed, maintaining her steady pace without deviation. Daniel, now farther along his route, adjusted his direction toward a residential corridor, the city gradually transitioning from dense downtown structures to quieter streets. The final impression of the day settled fully into a state of closure, where both paths, though separate, continued forward under the same night sky, carrying only the quiet acknowledgement that perception had been replaced by confirmed truth, and that no further resolution was required beyond the understanding already achieved.